When people think of sages in Assassin's Creed, the only ones they seem to remember are either Bartholomew Roberts and John Standish in Black Flag, and Francois Thomas Germain in Unity, and possibly also Elijah Miles if they really know about all the lore and read the comics. But there's actually another sage, specifically also from Black Flag, that I think a lot of people either forget about or completely don't even know exists, and that's Thomas Cavanaugh Jr. He was a sage who existed a few years before the main events of Black Flag and never physically appears in the game, but whose story is told through multiple bottled letters collectibles that can be found all throughout the game. His story is actually really interesting and even tragic, and with the recent news of Black Flag Resynced coming soon, I think it's time to take a look back at one of the more interesting lore points from the game that often gets overlooked. To learn more about Thomas Cavanaugh Jr., there are 20 bottled letters scattered all around Black Flag's map that we can find while reliving Edward Kenway's memories that were written towards the end of his life, and describe his experience as a sage, and at some point were sent out to sea by him from Long Bay, where the observatory is located. To quickly summarize what a sage is, in Assassin's Creed, the ancient race of the first civilization, who is nowadays known as the Isu, were trying to create methods of salvation to save themselves from an oncoming end of the world solar flare disaster, and as one of those methods of salvation, they tried to implant themselves into new bodies that would have hopefully survived the hostile environment created by that solar flare. One of the Isu named Aita volunteered himself as a test subject for this method, but it failed and left him in a catatonic state after degenerating his mind, and his wife Juno was forced to kill him, but not before implanting a hidden trigger in the human genome that would randomly cause Aita to reincarnate into a human body, with that human inheriting Aita's memories and essentially forcing two minds into one body, fighting for dominance, and are usually marked by having heterochromia, or two differently colored eyes, and anasacoria, or two differently sized pupils. Thomas Cavanaugh was born in 1652 in the British colony of Boston, Massachusetts, to middle-class parents Elizabeth and Thomas Cavanaugh Sr. And now in the year 1706, he's been living in isolation in the place of his ancestors at the observatory in pursuit of what he calls peace and steadiness of spirit. He mentions there being a strangeness in his blood and wishes for a better understanding of his condition as a sage, and has hope that if there are any others in the world who suffer the same perturbations of mind, that might find him a kindred soul and a friendly voice to guide them to the shores of sanity. He mentions that he was born a creature of two souls, one of which being his own, which he calls newly minted and fresh upon the world stage, and the other being what he calls an old and wise thing, and a soul as old as the universe itself may be. Ever since he was born, he was known to his parents and neighbors as a boy of strange habits, and was always having his eyes be asked about or commented on. He was also prone to strange behavior and constantly acted out gestures and signs and symbols with meanings that his parents couldn't decipher, and it was said he never cried or protested, which he says was unusual for a baby, but believes it to have been a comfort to his mother. He eventually ended up saying his first words at 12 months old, with his first words being "my love and beloved," which are obviously Aita's memories resurfacing and referring to Aita's wife Juno. Cavanaugh says that his parents believed him saying these words was a sign of robust intelligence, but were anxious about what the specific words implied. Cavanaugh says they were right to be anxious since by the time he was 2 years old he had taken up the habit of calling his parents by their names Elizabeth and Thomas, rather than referring to them as mother and father, calling it an impulse that he stuck to well past adolescence, which already shows the disconnect between his human self and stage identity. Cavanaugh explains that he loved living in Boston, calling it a place of great beauty and peace, and his father was a cobbler and his mother kept a modest house, raising him as best she could, living along the southern shore near the wharves where he could watch tall ships come and leave the colony, shuttling both goods and passengers, always being fascinated by them and the promise of adventure. As he wondered what lay beyond the horizon he could see, he realized that he wished to travel and knew from his early days that he wouldn't live out his life in Boston, but instead travel far and wide in search of the source of the strange secrets within him, despite being content at the time and loving his parents. At 4 years old, he eventually had his first vision of Aita's memories, which he called reveries, and up until that point had only the sense of his double mind, but upon experiencing this first memory, he described it as being offered a glimpse through a window into that second life within him. On a fresh autumn day, he was out with his parents picnicking at Beacon Hill, and as they were looking down upon the city, he described the coolness falling upon him, with the world seeming to darken and glow at the same time. He fell backwards and seemed to land into a pair of coddling arms with a voice calling him beloved and telling him to go to his rest. The voice also says his sacrifice won't be in vain, and though he'll pass from this life, they'll see him reborn to remain at their side forever. He calls this eerie, but at the same time felt a deep love, and never before or since this incident had he felt that depth of adoration. As the skies cleared and the world lit back up, he woke up laying on the ground with his parents standing over him calling his name. After this first vision, he began to experience isolation from his parents, and despite loving them and them having raised him well, he started feeling like he was different from them and not human like them at all. The first reverie he experienced began to cast this feeling even deeper into his mind, and there were multiple days where he didn't feel human and instead felt like an entirely different creature. Between the ages of 4 and 14, he experienced multiple memories and reveries and was able to see visions of cities made of glass, machines that generated lightning, and vehicles that could fly despite outwardly appearing to be a normal human to anyone else around him, but also described these visions to be too fanciful to be entertained by any sane minds. When he was 14 years old, his father decided to have him take up an apprenticeship as a carpenter, to have him learn a trade that would be sensible to his habits of mind. He ended up apprenticed under master carpenter joiner Jonathan Davenport of Boston. It's unknown but also highly unlikely that Jonathan Davenport has any sort of relation to Achilles Davenport, the mentor of the Colonial Brotherhood of Assassins seen in AC3 and Rogue, or Matthew Davenport, who was a British army officer but also Templar during the American Revolutionary War, who was a playable character in the old AC3 multiplayer. Jonathan Davenport was also a slave owner, had 2 other white boys employed under him, both of whom Kavanaugh describes as not being terribly clever, with one being a bricklayer and one being a carpenter. He says that Davenport saw in him a spark of intelligence and wit, and decided to hire him as a joiner, earning about £2 per year, which in today's money is about $527.08, or 406.62 pounds. He explains that a joiner's work requires both a nice and steady hand and a great taste in ornament, which was told by Davenport he had in large measure. This enabled him to leave the apprenticeship after just only 5 years compared to the usual 7, and at the age of 19 was a man and master in his own right and left to seek out his own success. Davenport wasn't sad to see him leave, but still wished him good fortune, for he knew that Kavanaugh was the greatest talent he had ever apprenticed up to that point, and told him there's something of a natural genius in him and he's wise beyond his years. Kavanaugh then packed up his possessions and wished his parents love and took passage on a merchant brig ship heading for Jamaica in the West Indies, where he explains carpenters of great skill were needed. At the time of writing these letters, he explained that in hindsight he thinks he should have been anxious at leaving Boston, and his parents who had raised him so well, but at the time he felt it was the greatest joy of his life and never before or since did he feel such freedom. However, after leaving, new voices came upon him even harder, and he described them as a man whispering in his ears, which he says were neither sinister in nature but also didn't prevent mature dealings with his fellow man. These voices were different to his reveries, where the reveries only came in his sleep or daydreams. The voices came at any time regardless of day or night, and were often inconvenient to his current situation and often intruded into his daily life. He describes the voices as though not being constant, they were frequent enough in nature, and had the qualities and memories of there even being times where he seemed to hear his own voice among them. He eventually starts to wonder if he was hearing conversations from a previous life and memories of those he once knew. One memory that was constantly repeated throughout his life consists of him hearing the voices of himself, a man, and 2 women. One of the women's voices asks why they shouldn't engineer humans to pass learned information to their offspring as biological traits, already passed from one generation to another, and says that's well within their scope. The other woman's voice angrily shouts that they've already made humans sturdy and strong, and asks why they should gift the humans with new advantages over them, and says that they're dying and the war is tilting against them and that they should discover a means to their own salvation, and not for the humans. The man's voice then says that their time is done, and the instruments of their will shall soon be their masters, and they shall fade away, possibly not in 10 or 20 years, but that this century is certain to be their last, and wonders why not gift the humans with added faculties for wisdom and growth, and pass on what they've learned to the next generations, and that the humans should be as wise as they are. Kavanaugh then hears his own voice speak and says that it can be done, and with manipulation of the code within the human's blood, they could improve them, and then before the memory ends, he again hears the second woman's voice scream, "Absolutely not." The voices that Kavanaugh heard are clearly a memory of a conversation between the Isu members Minerva, Juno, and Jupiter, as the other voices he heard, and Naita as his own voice. While traveling to the West Indies, Kavanaugh was sailing with a man named Savory, who was a pardoned pirate who came to work on his ship to pay off his debts as an honest Christian, and witnessed an incident in which he was killed. Kavanaugh explains that Savory ended up mistaking abjurations from his fellow crew members for insults, and as Savory was preparing his pistol for a planned 6 duels he was going to do later in the day, he accidentally killed himself with a self-inflicted pistol shot. Kavanaugh says that his crew were sad for Savory's misfortune, but at the same time weren't sorry that their crew grew quieter in his absence. Kavanaugh then had a realization upon seeing the blood flow out of Savory's body and remembered the voice in his memory talking about the code in their blood. He then realized that it made perfect sense to him that the code of life was embedded in human blood, and wondered how he was able to easily understand that despite no modern philosophies of the time understanding it. As he reached Jamaica, he tried to ignore all his thoughts and went looking for employment. With a letter of endorsement from his old master Jonathan Davenport, he was able to get an interview with an agent working for a wealthy plantation owner named Peter Beckford, who he says was known across the West Indies as a man of honor and good intelligence. The agent was so impressed by his work that he was immediately hired, and 2 days later started working upon the Beckford's plantation, fixing up the slave quarters with sturdier doors and tighter roofs. As for Kavanaugh himself, he was living in a modest house on the plantation with 3 windows, from which 2 of them gave him a good view of the cane fields, and when opened filled his room with a light breeze and a scent of the ocean as he heard the distant sounds of the waves. He was also calmed by the spiritual songs of the slaves working in the fields, and said it was pleasant there despite worrying about the thought of catching yellow fever, or any other sickness that often afflicted those newly arrived to the West Indies, after having seen over 17 men and women die from the disease within 6 months of him arriving, and it seemed that for every success he had another 2 or 3 potential hazards waiting for him. Kavanaugh then talks about his employer Peter Beckford, and says he was a man of great charisma and pride, who in 1662 had come to Jamaica and within 10 years had managed to procure himself a sizable portion of land, which he sowed sugarcane as early as possible. By the time Kavanaugh became employed under him, Beckford, according to himself, had owned one of the largest holdings of land in the world, rivaling only kings and emperors, and when he first came to Jamaica only had 3 slaves working under him, but now had managed to own over 300. Kavanaugh called him a shrewd and relentless businessman, but also says he was prone to anger and had a large temper, and that wrath and fury were his primary means of settling arguments that weren't in his favor. At the same time, he was kind and gracious to Kavanaugh, which Kavanaugh believes was down to his status and Beckford having respect for his high ranking. Beckford was also once the de facto governor of the island, and though he wasn't anymore by the time Kavanaugh arrived, he still had a sense of leadership and seemed to be a man born with a natural duty to lead. This also gave Beckford plenty of political connections, which he valued as deeply as sugar and money, and it was through these connections that Grand Master of the West Indies Templars Loreno Torres was brought to the island, who Kavanaugh says would go on to change his life for the worse forever. In April 1673, ships that were pretending to be from Holland came to Kingston, and were actually carrying Torres despite him being Spanish, who Kavanaugh says was once a soldier in the Spanish army, and now an emissary on behalf of the Spanish king, or so he'd like Peter Beckford to believe. Kavanaugh eventually somehow learned that Torres was a Templar, and that he actually came to see Beckford's collection of manuscripts that he'd collected, but it's unclear when or even how Kavanaugh learned that Torres was a Templar, or even knew what the Templars were before meeting the assassins. After 2 days of Torres visiting, he eventually met Kavanaugh, who seemed to be intensely focused on him, which Kavanaugh says stirred in Torres a strange sense of excitement, and Torres eventually asking him questions that shocked him to his core. One evening, Torres ended up directly asking Kavanaugh if he heard voices or memories from the dark of his mind, as if from an entirely other life. Kavanaugh tried to feign ignorance and pretended to not know what Torres meant, despite at the same time wondering how he knew the riddle of his life as if it was a fact, and eventually left to return to his room while still being full of anxiety, with Torres telling him to speak again when he's ready to talk. As he returned to his room, Kavanaugh fell asleep, but also into another memory between himself, Azaita, and Juno, where Juno tells him their colleagues conspire against them, content to champion humans, but there's hope for them and a chance they could survive and adapt to the new world. Kavanaugh hears his own voice ask what he must do, and Juno tells him the transference of their minds into new forms, either mechanical bodies or those of the humans in order to survive the coming catastrophe. Kavanaugh then hears his own voice say it's a dangerous prospect, but Juno says that's why he must be the one to make the leap, with an unparalleled mind as the architect of the observatory and overseer of Eden's tools, and the brightest light in their civilization, and if he's not capable of making the leap, then no one is. Kavanaugh then hears his own voice say that he'll do this for her and all other people, and calls her beloved. As he was in the middle of his memory, a letter slipped underneath his door from Torres apologizing for the alarm he raised, with his questions, but that Kavanaugh has the exact likeness of a man him and his colleagues have wanted to meet, as I says that he will explain everything if Kavanaugh met with him. Kavanaugh then paced around his room for hours, wondering what this meant and how he had the exact likeness of a man Torres once seemed to know, and why it was so important. Kavanaugh was about to leave his room when he suddenly started hearing gunshots from outside all across the plantation, which he described as if a war had begun, with him at the center. He then hid on the far side of his bed away from the windows and closed his eyes, but as he did, he heard a voice shouting his name and opened his eyes to see a figure standing in front of him wearing robes and a hood, who then took a blowpipe and blew a dart at Kavanaugh's neck, and while he tried to protest, he fell asleep. After a few days, he eventually woke up in a native village far from the plantation he called home, in the presence of the same man. The man introduced himself as Balaam, who he described as a native himself with a strong and serious but gentle face, and asked him not to be frightened. Kavanaugh wasn't frightened since Balaam was calm and his words were kind, and Kavanaugh then asked Balaam why he brought him here. Balaam tells him that he's a sage of his face, telling it plain with his eyes most of all, and that he's but one man in a long lineage of identical men who were born outside their original time, with his likeness and soul being a pattern throughout the ages. Balaam then says that oftentimes a century or more passes without the appearance of a sage, but other times two are born in the same decade and even they don't know why. Kavanaugh says that everything Balaam said he knew in some intrinsic way, but it frightened him all the same and questioned how it could be that he was a man reborn, and how he had already lived one life while still living a second, still wondering about the first. Kavanaugh then stayed with Balaam for several days as they each asked questions of each other, with Kavanaugh also wondering what Balaam wanted of him. After a week, Kavanaugh finally asked Balaam what he wanted of him and why he kept him prisoner, but Balaam just laughed and told him he's not a prisoner and that Kavanaugh could leave at any point, and if he told them where he wished to be dropped off, they'll do anything in their power to transport him there. Kavanaugh was initially surprised but then angry and asked Balaam why he kidnapped him, and Balaam tells him that his master Peter Beckford had hosted a Templar, and now be one himself, and says that such men are not to be trusted, especially not with a prize as valuable as Kavanaugh. Balaam then tells Kavanaugh to steer clear of them, for they seek the knowledge that hides in his mind, such as in his memories and dreams, and a location of the observatory, which he calls a place once dear to Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh then remembered hearing about the observatory from his memories, and then asked Balaam what he desires of him, and if he would also steal the secrets within him. But Balaam tells him that he wouldn't shun them, but to share them is for Kavanaugh to decide, and that his secrets are his alone to lend. After speaking with Balaam, Kavanaugh took a day to decide on what to do with strange notions and uncertainty battling in his head for supremacy, and never sat on one idea for too long before another option seemed to be better, until he decided to finally confront Balaam and leave. He tells Balaam that he had been gracious to him and trusts Balaam completely, but can't share his visions and memories without first understanding them himself, and therefore he must first travel in secret to the observatory which had occupied his thoughts for so many years. Balaam tells him he understands and fully believes in Kavanaugh's cause, and to find the source of these memories would do him some good. Kavanaugh thanks him and says he'll return with answers that may satisfy Balaam if what he finds also satisfies himself. Balaam and his young son Atabai, who was the mentor of the West Indies assassins by the time of AC4, then leave Kavanaugh some supplies and drop him off at a nearby fishing village. Balaam then warns him that the Templars are new to the West Indies, with Torres as their Grand Master, and though now few in number, there will soon be others, and tells him not to trust them and take heed of them, for what they can't get through conversation they will take by force. After leaving Balaam, Kavanaugh gathered a ship and a small crew, and sailed around the West Indies for almost an entire year to different places such as beaches and jungles, looking for any sort of sign or landform that might spark a memory. Kavanaugh met many people as he traveled around, many of whom were kind to him, and offered him work in exchange for more supplies, and he came to appreciate the people of both the New and Old Worlds finding the same hopes and desires within them. After about 13 months, he eventually found the location of the observatory at Long Bay, and knew he was in the right place by the amount and strength of the memories he experienced. He then left his crew behind and went alone into the jungle until finally finding the observatory himself. Without being prompted, he pressed his finger into what he knew was a door, which then opened and he stepped inside, but refused to write out what he saw inside the observatory in his letters, saying the world isn't ready yet to hear his tales, and it would all sound like sorcery except to his friend Balaam and the Templars who still hunt him. Kavanaugh then remained alone inside the observatory, learning all he could from its secrets, and getting a massive influx of memories from his previous life as Aita, that he says would be twice the size of the Bible if he were to write them out, until he eventually managed to fully understand the two souls within him and became content. After almost a week spent at the observatory, he was approached by the Guardians, who we see in-game in AC4, and says that they spotted him first and almost killed him, but after being surprised by them, his eyes widened to a point where they could easily see them, and they slowly dropped to their knees to bow to him after realizing who he was. Kavanaugh then understands that they were sworn to protect the observatory, and after speaking with them learned that it was a previous sage before him that had made them, and their ancestors the guardians of the observatory and had been doing so for the last 150 years, and was told that the previous sage's grave was nearby but unmarked and inaccessible. Kavanaugh then spends the next 40 years living with the guardians at the observatory, and after finally understanding who and what he is, the only question he has left is how many other sages have existed before him. He says that nearly 80 millennia have passed since their inception and believes the number to be quite high, but can't know for certain. He then tells the reader of the letters to find his final letter at the place where he instructed the guardians to bury him near the observatory after he dies. In Kavanaugh's final letter, he says that now in the year 1706, he is sick and in poor condition, but says he has one last memory to share, and that he can't prove or argue that he had a previous life, but wishes that if others like him were to find and read these letters, they might understand and not feel so alone as he had. He then goes on to explain he died in the middle of his wife's experiment, and the method of transferring one's mind into a machine, and then into a human body was a failure, but in his last moments remembers Juno comforting him, promising him his death wouldn't be an end but a beginning. Juno tells him that there's another way that's imperfect but possible, and says she'll agree to Minerva's experiments of gifting the ability to pass down memories to humans, but will instead add her own augmentations and will collect samples of the code in their blood and transfigure them in a way that when the right pieces come together, it will further transfigure the human zygote of a newly conceived child and will allow for him to be reborn throughout the ages. Juno then says it's a recessive recurrence, which means it exists on the recessive genes as opposed to dominant genes, which makes it more rare and will never die out, which makes him able to consistently be reborn. Juno then tells him his death won't be in vain and to look for her as she will be entombed and lying in wait, and ready to emerge when the time is right and they'll be with each other again, and then stabs him through the heart. Kavanaugh then says it's a bizarre and ludicrous idea that he can have a memory of his own death, but he knows that it happened, and now many centuries later from that time he waits for the final piece of the riddle to reveal itself but can't say how this will happen. Kavanaugh then tells anyone who has read his letters and understood little to not be upset, and that there's more mystery than sense in the world, and their only purpose is to endure it, and signs off his final letter. Thomas Kavanaugh is easily one of the more important but overlooked and forgotten characters in Assassin's Creed. His story is so extremely tragic, with being born as someone with the memories of another life he had no knowledge or control over for most of his life, and being hunted by Templars and then dying mostly alone on a forgotten hidden island in the West Indies with no one to be able to fully trust of his condition. I think most people who play Black Flag just collect these bottles to clear the map of the collectibles, and then completely ignore everything they have to say and don't read them, or don't even collect them at all. But they're actually really interesting, and going through these letters shows an entire other side to Black Flag's story that almost no one remembers or knows about, especially since Kavanaugh himself in the universe was forgotten and alone. Hopefully I've shown just how important Thomas Kavanaugh was, and people get a newfound interest in him in time for Resync to come out.